The movie opens in an elementary school classroom where math teacher Mrs. Wells addresses Danny, a student who has received a failing grade on his recent math test. Frustrated and indignant, Danny confronts Mrs. Wells with his marked paper displaying numerous red corrections and a prominent F at the top. Mrs. Wells, maintaining her composure, carefully reviews Danny's answers, noticing that he has written 2 plus 2 is equal to 22. With patience and understanding, she gently explains to Danny that his approach to addition is incorrect, acknowledging that learning can be challenging and mistakes are part of the process. However, Danny remains defiant and dismissive, responding with a defiant no to Mrs. Wells' attempts to guide him through his errors. Growing increasingly frustrated, Mrs. Wells firmly corrects Danny, asserting that the correct answer is 4, not 22. In a display of anger, Danny pushes the markers off the desk and storms out of the classroom, leaving Mrs. Wells speechless by his behavior. The following day, Danny's parents visit Mrs. Wells in her classroom with a complaint. Initially polite, they take a seat as Mrs. Wells invites them to share their concerns. Before they can speak, Mrs. Wells attempts to reassure them that there is nothing to worry about, unaware of the nature of their visit. She further adds that it is completely normal for kids like Danny to get frustrated when they are struggling with a subject, especially a subject like math where they can hardly use their creativity. Danny's mother doesn't seem to be grateful for Mrs. Wells's kind words. She ignores everything the teacher says and asks why Danny is getting some answers wrong in her so-called test. Mrs. Wells is taken aback by the rudeness, but doesn't show it in her face. She composes herself and starts explaining what kind of questions were on the test. After she states that Danny's answer to the question, "What is 2 plus 2 was 22, the room goes silent. One might think the parents realized that it was their son's mistake, but to Mrs. Wells's surprise, they ask her to go on, waiting for her to prove her point. It is clear that the couple doesn't understand that the kid's answer is wrong. The teacher bluntly says that 22 is not the right answer. The mother, in utter disbelief, asks Mrs. Wells, who says that the answer is wrong. Mrs. Wells replies that is how math works. The couple misses the whole point and accuses Mrs. Wells of calling their son stupid. The teacher explains that it was not her intention and that she is simply trying to correct his mistake. Things get heated when the dad starts to yell. He asks Mrs. Wells who she is to declare his son's answer is wrong and hers is right. Mrs. Wells is in complete shock at the stupidity of the couple. She tries to reason with them, stating that the answers are factual and they would never change. The mother acts like she understands Mrs. Wells's words, but then accuses her of being a Nazi and forcing absolute answers on her child. Confused by everything, the teacher bluntly asks the two if they know what 2 plus 2 equals to. Instead of an answer, Mrs. Wells gets insults thrown at her. The father calls her a smart-ass tramp, then mocks her accent. Their politeness from a while ago vanishes in thin air as they get more and more aggressive. Still being respectful, Mrs. Wells tells them that she can no longer continue the conversation and shows them the way out. Danny's mother claims that they're going to complain to the principal, while his father shouts his son is a free thinker for saying the answer is 22. Before leaving, the mother threatens to get her kicked out of the job and calls her a bitch. Having had enough of the two, Mrs. Wells sarcastically shames them for not knowing what 2 plus 2 is. The scene abruptly ends as the mother slaps Mrs. Wells on her face. The next day, the principal visits Mrs. Wells's class to discuss the incident with Danny's parents. Mrs. Wells begins by recounting the confrontational encounter, describing how the parents became increasingly aggressive and disrespectful during their conversation. As Mrs. Wells explains the situation, she expresses her shock and frustration at the parents' behavior, particularly noting that she was physically assaulted by Danny's mother. She seeks clarification from the principal on how the school intends to address such misconduct. However, Mrs. Wells is taken aback when the principal suggests that she should apologize to the parents for declaring Danny's answer wrong. The principal explains that the school's approach is focused on avoiding bias and promoting inclusivity, implying that teachers should refrain from imposing their views on students. Mrs. Wells, bewildered by this response, argues that math is an objective subject based on factual correctness, not subject to individual opinion or bias. She emphasizes that it is her responsibility as a teacher to guide students toward accurate understanding. The principal, growing increasingly impatient, asserts that Mrs. Wells's approach undermines the students' autonomy and respect, contradicting the school's policies. That day, a crowd of protesting parents gathers outside the school, accusing Mrs. Wells of undermining their children's confidence and demanding that she apologize for asserting that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Things get worse when they accuse her of hating children in general. The escalating situation prompts the school's superintendent and council to convene a meeting with Mrs. Wells. An anxious Mrs. Wells appeals for time to allow the situation to calm down, but the superintendent reveals that the school is facing legal action from parents claiming emotional distress to a minor. Mrs. Wells exclaims that she only said 2 plus 2 is 4, which shouldn't have caused this much trouble. The board members scoff at the comment and reply that she should admit the possibility of multiple correct answers to the same question. Mrs. Wells is in absolute disbelief. She knows that she is right, but the world seems to have changed to a weird place where every answer must be true and every fact is debatable. The principal accuses her of portraying everyone who disagrees with her as stupids. When Mrs. Wells stays put in her opinion, the board members suspend her and ask her to reconsider her extremist views if she ever wants to get back to her job. The next day, Mrs. Wells packs up all her belongings from the school and returns home. At night, she watches the TV and finds out that the scandal has made the national television. Many political leaders are debating if 2 plus 2 equals 22 or 4. The media exaggerates the news and calls Mrs. Wells an activist who was caught abusing a kid's First Amendment rights. She is being called a liberal elitist for saying that 4 is the definite answer to the simple question. Some even belittle Mrs. Wells for not keeping the students in her class for more than a year, to which Mrs. Wells angrily says it's called graduating. While she is watching the news, annoyed at some of the reporters' stupidity, she gets a call from the school. The principal informs her that she has officially been fired. He also asks her to come by the school the next day and requests her to stop radicalizing the students. The following day, Mrs. Wells goes to the school for the last time. As she walks through the entrance, she is greeted by a group of reporters patiently waiting for her. The school has invited them to prove they do not support Mrs. Wells's extremist view and to make it clear she is no longer their employee. Before officially signing the papers and ending her contract with the school, the principal says he will pay her the monthly salary for the last 2 terms. The salary rounds up to $2,000 for the last month and $2,000 for this one. The principal says that is $4,000 in total, but at last, Mrs. Wells claps back and claims it is actually $22,000. The movie ends as the principal awkwardly looks towards the reporters and back at a smiling Mrs. Wells. Thanks for watching.